There comes a moment in many lives that almost no one sees from the outside. You are still functioning. You are still answering messages, showing up, smiling at the right moments, saying, "I'm just tired," when people ask how you are. You still know how to move through the world in a way that looks normal enough. But inside, something has gone quiet. Something essential has stepped back. And what makes it so painful is that you cannot point to one dramatic event and say, "That is where I disappeared." You just know that somewhere along the way, you became harder to find. Maybe you started noticing it in small moments. When someone asks what you want, and you feel blank. When you say yes, before you even check in with yourself. When you explain your feelings as if you are presenting a case in court, hoping to be found reasonable enough to deserve understanding. When you lie awake at night, exhausted by how much of your life has become performance, management, adjustment. When you realize you have become deeply skilled at staying connected to everyone except yourself. And maybe the strangest part is this: you did not lose yourself because you were careless. You lost yourself because at some point it felt safer. That is the hidden tragedy. Self-abandonment rarely begins as weakness. It often begins as intelligence, as adaptation, as the quiet brilliance of a nervous system that learned how to survive in an environment where being fully yourself felt costly. Perhaps you learned that love became uncertain when you had needs. That conflict became dangerous when you told the truth. That closeness depended on being easy, pleasing, useful, undemanding. Perhaps you discovered very early that being accepted had less to do with who you were and more to do with how well you could read the room, soften your edges, disappear your anger, translate your pain into something more comfortable for other people to receive. So you became fluent in self-erasure, not all at once, not dramatically, just in little daily betrayals, a swallowed no, a smile over hurt, a silence where a boundary should have been, a habit of explaining yourself long after your truth was already clear, a constant reaching outward for permission to feel what you feel. And because this pattern is so common, people often mistake it for kindness. They call you mature, thoughtful, generous, emotionally aware. They may even admire your patience. But what they do not see is how expensive it is to be admired for the ways you disappear. Because losing yourself is not only about not knowing your favorite color anymore, or feeling unsure about your next step in life. It is something much deeper. It is a fracture in the relationship between your inner world and your outer life. It is what happens when your authentic responses keep being overridden for so long that your mind no longer trusts them. Your body no longer signals clearly, and your soul begins to feel like a distant country you once belonged to. This is where Jung becomes deeply relevant, not as an abstract thinker, but as someone who understood what it means to become divided within yourself. Jung believed that much of human suffering comes from disowning parts of who we are, not only the dark or destructive parts, but also the alive parts, the angry part that knows when something is wrong, the selfish part that protects what is sacred, the grieving part that refuses to pretend, the powerful part that no longer wants to shrink in order to be loved, the instinctive part that feels before it explains. When these parts are rejected, they do not disappear. They move into the shadow. The shadow is often misunderstood. People hear the word and imagine something ugly, dangerous, shameful. But the shadow is not merely the worst in you. It is everything you were taught not to be. Everything that became inconvenient to your belonging. Everything your personality pushed underground in order to keep your relationships intact. So, if you were taught that anger makes you difficult, your anger goes into the shadow. If you were taught that confidence makes you arrogant, your power goes into the shadow. If you were taught that sadness burdens others, your sorrow goes into the shadow. If you were loved for being helpful, but not for being real, then your realness itself may begin to live in the dark. This is why so many emotionally exhausted people feel confused by their own lives. On the surface, they are trying very hard to be good, loving, safe, available. But underneath, there is resentment they cannot fully explain, numbness they feel guilty for, irritation at small things, sudden fantasies of disappearing, a secret desire to burn everything down and start over. That does not mean they are broken. It means the parts of them that were exiled are asking to come home. And this is where it gets even more painful, because the personality you built to survive may now be the very thing preventing you from living. The over-explaining, the people-pleasing, the hyper-awareness of others, the endless self-correction, the instinct to make yourself understandable before you make yourself honest. These patterns may have once protected you from rejection, punishment, loneliness, chaos. But protection and identity are not the same thing. What saves you in one season can slowly suffocate you in another. Many people live for years assuming they have an anxiety problem, a motivation problem, a discipline problem, when what they actually have is an estrangement problem. They are not failing to become someone. They are living too far away from who they already are. And the body knows this long before the mind is ready to admit it. It shows up as fatigue that rest does not fix, as brain fog in conversations where you are not being real, as tension after saying yes when you meant no, as sadness after being praised for a version of yourself that feels nothing like home, as a strange hollowness after social interactions, even good ones, because you were present in body, but absent in truth. This is one of the most devastating consequences of chronic self-abandonment. You can become deeply lonely in relationships where nothing looks obviously wrong. You may be surrounded by people and still feel unseen, not because no one cares, but because the self they are relating to is partially edited. They are loving the version of you that knows how to keep the peace, not the one carrying the unspoken grief, the unexpressed anger, the unspectacular truth. Then another wound forms. You start to believe that even if someone loved you, they would not really be loving you. They would be loving your adaptation. This is why people who lose themselves often struggle to receive love. Love lands on the mask and slides off. Compliments do not reach the wound. Reassurance does not touch the fear, because the deeper question remains unanswered. Would I still be wanted if I stopped managing how I am perceived? That question changes everything, because now your life is not just exhausting, it becomes internally unsafe. Every interaction becomes a subtle negotiation between authenticity and attachment. Every boundary feels like a threat. Every disappointment feels like proof that your instincts are dangerous. Every attempt to return to yourself feels selfish, dramatic, or too late. But it is not too late, and it is not selfish. In fact, one of the most important shifts in emotional healing is realizing that losing yourself was never the final story. It was a strategy, a painful one, yes, sometimes a heartbreaking one, but still a strategy. And strategies can be understood. They can be honored for how they tried to protect you. And then, slowly, they can be released. This is where real healing begins, not by shaming a part of you that adapted, but by seeing it clearly. You do not heal self-abandonment by waging war against yourself. You do not heal by calling yourself weak for struggling to speak up, or foolish for staying too long, or pathetic for needing validation. That only deepens the split. Healing begins when you can look at your patterns with honesty and tenderness at the same time. Something in you learned that authenticity was unsafe. Something in you learned that being chosen required self-betrayal. Something in you learned that your worth increased when your needs disappeared. And now something deeper in you is trying to unlearn all of it. That inner transformation is often very quiet at first. It does not always look empowering. Sometimes it looks like confusion, like not being able to tolerate certain conversations anymore, like feeling unexpectedly angry when someone assumes access to you, like losing interest in dynamics that once felt normal, like crying over something small because it was never about that one thing, like needing more solitude, not because you are withdrawn from life, but because your inner life is trying to speak in a language you can finally hear. Many people become frightened during this phase. They think they are becoming cold, unstable, distant, too sensitive. But often, they are simply becoming less available for what used to cost them too much. That is not dysfunction. That is discernment being born. Jung called the deeper process of becoming whole individuation. It is the lifelong movement toward becoming who you actually are, rather than who you had to be. It is not a polished spiritual journey. It is messy, humbling, disorienting. Because to become whole, you must stop identifying only with the parts of yourself that were socially rewarded. You must make room for the inconvenient truths. You must admit that your goodness may have been mixed with fear, that your patience may have concealed powerlessness, that your empathy may have sometimes been hypervigilance, that your constant understanding of others may have served as an escape from understanding yourself. This is not meant to make you cynical about your heart. It is meant to free your heart from the burdens it was never meant to carry, because there is a profound difference between love and self-erasure. Love does not require you to abandon your center. Care does not require chronic explanation. Kindness does not require silence when something hurts. Compassion does not mean tolerating what diminishes you. And being emotionally mature does not mean being infinitely absorbent. At some point, healing asks you a difficult question. What have you been calling love that was actually fear of disconnection? That question can feel brutal, but it is also liberating, because once you begin to see the pattern, you stop romanticizing your suffering. You stop treating your exhaustion as evidence of virtue. You stop assuming that the more pain you can hold quietly, the more worthy you are. You begin to understand that one of the deepest forms of self-respect is no longer turning your inner life into collateral for outer peace. This changes your relationships. At first, it may create tension. People who were comfortable with your self-abandonment may not know what to do with your presence. They may call you different, intense, selfish, hard to read. Not always because they are cruel, but because every system resists change when one person stops playing their old role. This is why returning to yourself can feel lonely before it feels liberating. The false harmony begins to crack before the real peace arrives. You may outgrow conversations built on emotional asymmetry. You may feel grief for the version of you that kept everything smooth. You may have moments where you almost want to go back, not because it was healthy, but because it was familiar. Do not mistake familiarity for alignment. There are seasons in healing when the old self no longer fits and the new self is not fully formed. That in-between space can feel empty, but it is sacred. It is where the performance begins to loosen. It is where the shadow starts returning its gifts. It is where anger becomes information instead of danger, where sadness becomes truth instead of weakness, where desire becomes guidance instead of guilt, where your no stops being cruelty and starts becoming self-trust. And self-trust is the real turning point. Not confidence in the loud, polished sense, not the performance of certainty. I mean the quieter, deeper kind, the kind that says, I can stay with myself when truth becomes uncomfortable. I can disappoint others without abandoning my soul. I can feel guilt without assuming I have done something wrong. I can be misunderstood and still remain intact. That kind of self-trust changes the architecture of your life. You stop chasing clarity from people who benefit from your confusion. You stop over-explaining what your body already knows. You stop forcing connection where your spirit keeps shrinking. You stop making a project out of being digestible. And something unexpected happens. You become calmer, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because the civil war inside you begins to quiet. The part that feels and the part that performs are no longer fighting for total control. The abandoned parts begin to sense that someone is finally listening, that someone is finally willing to tell the truth, even if the voice shakes, that someone is you. This is why the journey back to yourself is not about becoming someone new. It is about ending the habit of leaving. It is about noticing in real time the moments when you are about to override your own reality and choosing differently, even in small ways. It is about honoring the first flicker of discomfort before it turns into resentment. It is about letting your inner world matter before it becomes an emergency. It is about understanding that your needs are not obstacles to love. They are part of what makes love real. And perhaps most importantly, it is about grieving, because healing is not only empowerment, it is also mourning. Mourning the years spent performing safety. Mourning the tenderness you did not receive. Mourning the younger versions of you who became so skilled at staying pleasant that they forgot they were allowed to be whole. That grief matters. It is not regression. It is reverence. It is the heart finally telling the truth about what it cost to survive. So, if you have been feeling distant from yourself lately, if you have been tired in a way sleep cannot solve, if your life looks acceptable on the outside but feels strangely absent on the inside, listen carefully. This may not be the end of you. It may be the end of your adaptation being mistaken for your identity. Something deeper may be trying to emerge. Not louder, not harder, truer. The self you lost was never fully gone. It has been waiting beneath the roles, beneath the explanations, beneath the compulsive caretaking, beneath the fear of being too much. It has been waiting in your exhaustion, in your grief, in your sudden intolerance for what once felt normal. It has been waiting every time your body went heavy, in the middle of a conversation your soul did not agree to. And now, perhaps, you are finally ready to listen, not to the voice that tells you to be better, not to the voice that tells you to be easier, not to the voice that tells you love must be earned through reduction, but to the quieter voice beneath all of that. The one that says, come back. Come back to the anger that protects what is sacred. Come back to the sadness that reveals what mattered. Come back to the instinct that knew before the mind explained. Come back to the parts of you that were sent away just for telling the truth. You do not need to become perfect to return to yourself. You do not need everyone to understand. You do not need permission to stop abandoning what is real in you. You only need the courage to recognize that losing yourself was never proof that you were weak.